What is the worth of a human soul? In Devil's Pit, the answer was $5 silver. The price for a girl with no name, no memory, and eyes that were already dead on the inside. But her buyer was no slaver. He was another kind of ghost, a gunslinger, who wore silence as armor and carried secrets of his own. He didn't know that he had just bought a deadly secret, a past buried in fire and deceit. And in the coming flight, the question wasn't whether he could save her, but whether two broken souls could stand together against the enemies they didn't even know they had. The town of Devil's Pit only came to life after the sun had died. It wasn't on any map, appearing only like a fever in the night, a place where oil lamps burned low and the law was a forgotten whisper. Beneath the sagging canvas of a shadow market, the air was thick with the smell of cheap liquor and sweat. The crowd pressed in, men with weary eyes and silver to spare, betting on horses, saddles, and soon on people. "It doesn't talk," the auctioneer rasped, his voice as sharp as broken. "Glass, remembers nothing. $5, take it or leave it." A few guttural laughs echoed. Someone spat onto the dusty ground. On the rickety wooden platform stood a girl, perhaps no older than 17. Her hair was matted in desolate knots on her shoulders, her dress torn and stained with the colors of a long, aimless road. Her hands were clasped together, trembling without cease. But her eyes, the color of dead ash, were dry and hollow. The eyes of someone who had already left her body long ago. "No name," the auctioneer continued, patting the post beside her as if selling. "Livestock, no papers, no past. We call it the lost soul. $5 flat." From the edge of the crowd, a shadow shifted. Boon Whitaker stood as still as a stone, his boots caked in trail dust and the brim of his hat pulled low. He did not speak. People rarely heard his voice. He stepped forward, his long coat brushing past other shoulders, and held out $5 dollars tarnished by time. He didn't raise them high, just enough to be seen. Then he let them fall into the tin bucket beside the auctioneer. The clang of metal rang out, sharper and more final than any spoken bid. The crowd fell silent. A few men exchanged glances, one sneered, "Good one, Whitaker." Buying a mute to match your own sullenness. Boon did not reply. His eyes, deep and heavy as the night, remained fixed on the girl. She looked up at him, just for a moment. But in that fleeting glance, something shifted. Not recognition, not hope, but perhaps a pause in her endless fall. "Sold," the auctioneer grunted, stuffing the coins into his vest before shoving the girl toward the edge of the stage. She didn't move fast. She didn't look back. Boon stepped forward and took her elbow. A gentle hold, not to drag, not to own, just to guide. Together they walked through the gap the crowd had made. Mocking laughter followed them. "She's all yours, ghost and all," someone called out. But then a hand shot out, grabbing the girl's wrist. "Let's see what your $5 bought you, cowboy." Boon stopped. He did not speak. He just slowly turned, his hand drifting toward the hilt of the revolver hidden beneath his dusty coat. His fingers never closed around it. They didn't need to. The man let go. Silence followed them out of the tent dot outside. The night was cleaner. Stars wheeled overhead, and the moon cast a thin silver ribbon across the trail north. Boon walked beside the girl, never ahead, never behind. When they reached his horse, an aging Mustang named Flint, he offered her the saddle blanket. She wrapped it around herself without question. Still, no words passed between them. He mounted, then extended a gloved hand. She hesitated, looked at him, then took it. Together, they rode away. The journey to Forsaken Canyon took a full day and nearly a night. Boon did not speak, and the girl, who still bore no name, did not ask. She sat behind him on Flint's saddle, her hands holding loosely to the cantle, her chin tucked beneath his duster. The trail wound between red rock cliffs and sagebrush under a pale moon that served as a silent witness. When they reached the cabin, Boon dismounted without a word. The girl followed, her dress still torn and dust clinging to her feet. Like a shadow. But she stood straight, her eyes tracking his every movement, like a caged animal trying to decide if the new walls were safer than the old ones. The cabin wasn't much. Hand-cut pine, a patched roof, a porch that groaned with memory. Boon unlocked the door with a brass key and pushed it open. He stood aside again, waiting. She looked at him, then at the inviting darkness within, and crossed the threshold. He lit an oil lamp, revealing the space inside. A single room, low-ceilinged, the air cool. A small cot against one wall, a table and 2 chairs. The hearth was cold, but ready with firewood. Boon did not speak. He simply walked to the table and set down a square piece of pine wood. She glanced. Down, on the wood, 2 lines had been carved with deep, steady strokes. You can leave, or stay. No name, no explanation. Just that dot. She didn't touch the wood, but her tense shoulders eased slightly. Boon pointed to the cot, then to himself, gesturing toward a blanket roll beside the hearth. The message was clear. The bed was hers, the fire was his. There were no locks, no threats. Only silence. That night he slept lightly. He heard the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of a blanket, and the soft breath of someone trying not to cry, but she did not run. The next morning, she was sitting on the porch, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the sun rise over the canyon rim. She didn't flinch when he brought her a cup of water and a piece of cornbread. She only took it gently, nodded once, and stared back at the cliffs. The second day passed the same. Boon went to check the traps he'd set on the pass. When he returned, he found the floor had been swept, and the chipped cup from breakfast was washed and turned upside down to dry. She was on the porch again, braiding a strip of fabric from her torn dress into a loop. He said nothing, just nodded. On the third day, Boon left something else on the table. It was a leather-bound notebook, its corners frayed. Beside it lay a stub of a pencil, sharpened with a knife. On the first page, he had printed carefully, "Write what you remember." She stared at it for a long time. That night, after Boon returned from splitting firewood, the notebook was still untouched. But by morning, he saw the page had changed. In shaky but clear letters, 3 words had been written: "I saw fire," and below, in smaller print, then nothing. Boon sat for a long time, looking at those words. Then he turned the notebook around, took the pencil, and wrote beneath her line, "Sometimes nothing is a mercy." He left the notebook open and went to tend to his horse. That evening, she added something else: a necklace, blue stones. "I lost it," he answered. "Some things find their way back." They did not speak, but their conversation grew. On the 7th night, she stood by the hearth while Boon mended a boot. The fire crackled, and shadows danced on the ceiling. She pointed toward the old saddle by the door. He looked up. She made a slow, clear motion. She placed 2 fingers over her heart, then moved them outward like the wind. Then she touched her own chest. He understood. She didn't remember her name, but she was trying to reclaim it. He stood, walked to the saddle, and pulled out his carving knife. From a scrap of leather, he cut a small tag. He handed it to her, along with the pencil. She looked down at it, then in neat, careful letters, she wrote Kalan Eliza. It was not yet a memory, but it was a beginning. And that night, for the first time, Boon did not sleep beside the hearth. He unrolled his blanket near the door, but when he looked back, he saw the cot was untouched. She had taken the chair, facing the window, facing the night, because maybe, just maybe, she believed she wasn't running anymore. The morning sun was gentle that day, filtered through thin clouds and the rustling cottonwoods behind the cabin. Boon had gone to the south ridge to clear brush, and Eliza, still adjusting to the weight of that borrowed name, busied herself around the barn. She had taken to the work with a quiet focus, feeding the chickens, mending the saddle blanket, sweeping the porch. But that day, she pushed open the old barn door and stepped inside, brushing past cobwebs and dust that smelled of horses long gone. Light slanted through the cracked roof, and everything was hushed like a memory waiting to be unearthed. She started with the tack wall, sorting ropes from harnesses. Then, under a rotted feed barrel, her fingers brushed against cloth. She knelt and pulled it free. A handkerchief of faded linen, once white. In one corner, barely legible, were 2 letters, embroidered in thread worn thin by time. ER. She stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. Her hand trembled as she folded it, walked back to the cabin, and laid it on the table next to the notebook Boon had given her. When Boon returned later that afternoon, he found the smoothed-out handkerchief, and beneath it, a note in her careful handwriting. I think it's mine. Boon studied the letters. He looked at the cloth, then walked to the back shelf and pulled out an old roll of township maps he once used when working cattle trails. He unrolled them on the table, his calloused fingers scanning the paper until he found what he was looking for. Remington Ranch. It lay just north of a town called Hollow Bluff, and beside it, scribbled in faded ink near the ledger margin, was a name, Eliza Remington. Boon turned slowly toward her. She was standing in the doorway, watching him. Her arms were crossed, but not in defense, simply waiting. He pointed to the name on the map. Her eyes followed, then locked onto it. Eliza, he said softly, the first word he had spoken to her in. Dazed, she did not flinch. Her lips parted, but no words came out yet. Instead, she walked to the table, touched the map, and then nodded once, a small, decisive gesture. She would wear this name, even if it wasn't whole, even if its pieces were still scattered in her mind like ash. That evening, after their meal, Boon brought out something he hadn't touched in years. A battered harmonica, dented at one edge but still able to sing. He sat by the fire, said nothing, and began to play. It was a simple tune, low and steady, like a lullaby made for open skies and sleeping colts. Eliza sat at the table, her arms folded, her eyes half-lidded. Then suddenly, without warning, she gasped, a small sharp sound, as if a string had just snapped. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears welled without shame. Boon stopped playing. She shook her head, not for him to stop, but as if to hold back something breaking free. She whispered, her voice barely audible, her first complete sentence. That song. I knew it once. And then she cried. Not from pain, but from the cracking open of something that had been sealed too tight. He did not go to her. He only placed the harmonica on the table, stood and stoked the fire. Behind him, she cried alone, but no longer as a ghost. That night, she wrote a final line in her journal. If my name is Eliza, then maybe I wasn't lost. Maybe I was just waiting to be found. The days settled into a rhythm neither had planned, but both accepted. Until the knock. On the door. It was mid-morning. The cabin smelled of baking bread. Eliza was kneeling by the hearth, her hands deep in dough. The knock was soft, too soft for a stranger. Boon went to the door. A man stood there, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His smile came too fast. Morning, he said. Name's Ray Carter. Looking for the trail back to Hollow Bluff. You know the way? Boon's eyes narrowed. Behind him, the ball of dough slipped from Eliza's hands. She had frozen, her hands trembling. The stranger's eyes flicked toward the noise, curious. You got company? Boon stepped forward, just enough to block the view inside. Ain't no trail through here, he said evenly. Best you ride back. The man studied him for a beat too long, then tipped his hat and walked away. When Boon turned around, Eliza was gone. He found her in the old root cellar, curled up behind the potato crates, breathing too fast, her eyes wide with terror. He sat beside her, said nothing, just waited. When she finally looked at him, she whispered, He used to have a badge." Boon asked no more. That night, they packed. He saddled Flint and another mare, loaded a week's worth of supplies, and left the cabin behind. They rode east, staying off the main trails, hugging the dry ravines and narrow ridgelines that only mountain men knew. Eliza didn't speak much, but she rode steady. She never once asked where they were going. She knew better than to want certainty. She had lived in the in-between for too long. 3 days later, they passed through a windswept crossing where the desert gave way to dry grassland. There was a trading post and a small crowd, nothing more than a pop-up market with canvas tents, loud voices, and children chasing chickens through the dust. Boon stopped to water the horses. Eliza dismounted, her hands on the reins, when a boy no older than 6 ran straight into her. He was crying, Ma's gone, I lost her." Eliza knelt instinctively. The boy's cheeks were streaked with dirt, his breath hitching. Boon stepped forward, but Eliza raised a hand. Not to stop him, but to say, "I've got this." She reached into her satchel, pulled out a piece of paper from her notebook, and drew with quick, certain strokes. A square for the tents, a circle for the well, arrows for the paths between the wagons. She handed the boy the map, pointing to a marked spot. She took his hand, turned him around, and gave him a gentle push. The boy nodded, clutched the paper, and ran. Boon said nothing, but Eliza stood taller. Not because she remembered who she was, but because in that moment she had become someone again. A helper, a guide, someone real. And when she looked at Boon afterward, a quiet truth passed between them. Not a name, not a question. Just a truth. That even ghosts can come back to life. Hollow Bluff looked like any other sun-baked town pressed into the red clay hills of Texas, but Boon Whitaker knew better. The moment he stepped off his horse, he saw it in the glances that lingered too long. The sheriff's office missing a door, but still hanging a badge, and the crooked sign above the mercantile that read Hazelton. Boon said nothing as he helped Eliza down. Her hair was tucked under his coat collar, the harmonica case clutched tight in her hand. They were strangers here, and that was the point. At the end of the main street was their destination, a former apothecary turned law office. Boon knocked once and let Eliza enter first. Inside, Hal Norris looked up. Once a federal lawyer now. He was a relic with dusty files and a half bottle of bourbon hidden beneath the floorboards. Boon didn't need to speak. Hal studied Eliza, not her clothes or her face, but her posture, the posture of someone who hadn't always been afraid, but had learned how to be. "Eliza Remington?" he asked. She stiffened. Boon tensed. But Eliza did not run. She slowly reached into her coat and handed Hal the handkerchief embroidered with ER and a page from her notebook. In her careful script, she had written, "I remember. The letters, the garden, the man with ink on his hands. I sent something to you." Hal sat down hard. 5 years ago, he whispered. "I got unsigned letters about land fraud, hush money, dirty deals. They stopped the day the mayor's house burned down and his daughter vanished." He looked at Boon. She was the whistleblower. Eliza clutched the harmonica case tighter. She hadn't spoken since the ravine, but her eyes said enough. "That means she's in danger," Hal said. "If anyone finds out." "They already have," Boon said. "A man followed us." She recognized him. Former lawman. Hal's face darkened. He pulled a thick folder from his drawer. "This is what they burned my old office for. One original deed, off-the-book schematics. Then the dog outside barked. A window shattered. The first bottle hit the drapes. Flames bloomed. Move!" Boon shouted. Hal grabbed the folder. Eliza froze. Boon did not. He scooped her up and burst out the back, the door flying off its hinges as the fire roared behind them. The office went up like tinder old papers, dry wood, and the vengeance of men who wanted the truth dead in the alley. Boon pulled them behind crates. No help came. Not when Hazelton's men were involved. Boon covered Eliza's mouth with a cloth, trying to calm her breathing. She was scared, but not broken. Not this time. She still held the folder. Ash rained down like judgment from the heavens. The office was gone, but the evidence was not. Hal coughed beside them. They wanted to destroy the last copy. Eliza looked at the fire, her eyes no longer hollow. She passed the folder back to Hal. Then she opened her notebook, and with trembling fingers, she wrote, "We will finish tonight." They did not sleep. Boon kept his rifle loaded. Hal drafted a plan. And Eliza, in the glow of a stolen lantern, rewrote the testimony she had once mailed in secret. This time, it would not be anonymous. And Boon, he would not run. In a town built on silence, they would make the truth loud enough to burn. The fire had left a scar. Behind Hal's office was blackened wood and the twisted skeletons of what once held secrets. But in an abandoned mill outside Stone Hollow, under a lantern hung low, Boon and Eliza sat across from each other with more truth between them than either had spoken in years. Boon had been quiet most of the night, his hands working along the grain of his rifle stock as if it could steady something deeper. Eliza waited, as she always did, not with impatience, but with a knowing calm. When he finally looked at her, it was like watching a long-rusted door creak open. "My name, Boon Whitaker," he said slowly, his voice grated by dust and time, "ain't the name I was born with. It's the one I chose after I got out." Eliza tilted her head slightly. "Wasn't a killer," he said, "but they made me one. Wrong place, wrong card game, wrong badge, walking through the wrong saloon. I took the blame. 5 years in Leavenworth." He met her eyes. That's where I learned silence. She did not flinch, did not look away. "I came out meaner than I went in," he admitted. "Wore a new name like a second skin. Figured I could vanish if I was quiet enough." Eliza reached for the notebook she always kept close. She opened it to the first page, the one where her handwriting was still jagged and scared. Boon had seen that page a dozen times, but this time. She gently touched it, then laid her hand flat over it. "We both lived lies," she said softly, her voice like a breath through cracked glass. "But now we've chosen truth." Boon looked down, his jaw set. Then slowly something shifted. "Eliza," he said, not like a question, not like a name he'd found, but like one he'd finally accepted. "You got your name back, you keep it." Her lips curved into the smallest smile. She didn't need to reply. Her hand was still on the notebook. And that said enough. They decided they would not take the truth to some far-off judge. They would take it back to Ghost Fork. Eliza wrote on a scrap of wrapping paper, "Then we'll carry it ourselves." Boon stared at the words. He let out a single low, dry chuckle. "You sure you're ready to walk into the devil's parlor and knock on his door?" Eliza lifted the harmonica case she never let go. Inside was the folded handkerchief, a page from her journal, and the deed Hal had rescued. "We've both been ghosts long enough," she said. Boon nodded, stood, and holstered his revolver. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice softer now, "I never meant to keep running. I just forgot what it felt like to have something worth standing for." Eliza stepped beside him. "You remember now," she said. And they rode out together, not as fugitives, not as shadows, but as two souls who had finally decided the truth was not a thing to survive alone. The hall at Ghost Fork hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of townsfolk, hats in laps, the silence thick in the hot air. The words, "the hearing," were scratched in charcoal behind a shaky podium. There was no judge, no gavel. Only Eliza Remington, no longer the ghost girl, standing there. Behind her, Boon Whitaker stood, silent as always, but unshakable. "I was Born here, Eliza began, her voice clear, though her hands trembled. Eliza Remington, daughter of Mayor Franklin Remington. 5 years ago, I disappeared. She held up the brittle papers from Hal Norris's satchel. They said I ran. They said I betrayed my family. But I ran because I saw what they were doing. Land deeds signed away to criminals, county records erased, power traded for silence. Whispers spread through the crowd. From the back, a voice growled. You got no proof. 3 of acting Mayor Green's men pushed through the crowd. You call this justice? One spat. She's a runaway, he's a convict. Then the first man raised his gun. Boon was already moving, but not fast enough. The gunshot cracked like thunder. Boon stepped between Eliza and the barrel. The bullet caught him in the side. He grunted, falling to his knees. No! Eliza screamed, catching him as blood spread across his shirt. The room exploded in chaos. Shouts, panic. But Hal Norris roared. Stand down! Eliza held Boon tight, her voice breaking as she cried out, He's not a nobody. He's Boon Whitaker, and he saved me. The crowd went still. Hal raised his hands. Boon Whitaker served 5 years for a crime he didn't commit. He's lived under a false name, hunted for a past that wasn't his fault. And today, he chose to bleed for someone else's truth. A man in the crowd called out, He saved my son's cattle. Another, He pulled my brother from a flood. The mood shifted, not with violence, but with resolve. The people moved, not in fear, but in unity. Green's men, outnumbered, lowered their weapons. Hal held up the folder, now stained with soot and blood. These crimes won't be buried, not again. As Boon was lifted onto a stretcher, Eliza walked beside him, her hand on his chest, her eyes never leaving his face. She looked back at the townsfolk and said, He gave me my name back. It's time this town remembered its own. The doors opened to a sky painted gold with the late afternoon. The wind had shifted. The silence had ended. And in the space left behind, justice finally took root. The cell in Ghost Fork's modest jailhouse was cleaner than Boon expected. Not that it mattered. He knew steel bars when he saw them, and the name on the intake log, Boon Whitaker, alias of Elias Rourke, had sealed his stay. But he sat straight, arms folded, his expression steady. No fear, just the waiting of a man who had stopped running. It was Eliza who walked in with Hal Norris and the new mayor, a stout woman named Marjorie Kelt, who had once kept the post office and now ran the town with calm hands and clearer eyes. She carried the signed pardon herself, walked past the sheriff's desk, and unlocked the door without ceremony. Eliza's statement stands, she said, her voice firm. You were hunted for the name they gave you, not for the man you chose to become. The court sees the difference. You're free. Boon stood slowly. He looked to Eliza. She didn't smile, not yet, but her hand reached for his and gripped it hard. In silence, she led him outside. They did not go back to her father's estate. That place was stone and shame. Instead, they rode quietly, without parade, back to the hills above Last Canyon, where the shack still leaned in the wind and the chickens still scratched the dust near the porch. There, Eliza unpacked the only things she had taken from her past, a small harmonica and a worn notebook, its pages half filled with ink and ash. They built a life, one morning at a time. Boon repaired the fence. Eliza grew herbs by the window. Every dawn, before she rose, he would leave a sliver of fresh bread on the windowsill, beside a sprig of wildflower. Not a grand gesture, just a presence, like breath, like forgiveness. The townsfolk, once curious, became kind. They didn't pry. Sometimes a neighbor dropped off flour. Sometimes a girl from the schoolhouse came to borrow a book. And once, Hal Norris rode up with a package of blank journals tied in twine. Eliza's earned her ink, he said, tipping his hat. But it wasn't until the morning she carved the sign that Boon understood just how much had changed. He found her at the gate, hammer in hand, tapping a wooden plank into place between two fence posts. The words were burned deep into the grain, steady and proud. Home, where nitrogen monoxide one runs anymore. Boon looked at her. You sure? He asked. Eliza nodded. You're not running. And I'm not hiding. He stared at the words a moment longer, then reached out, took her hand, and kissed her fingers. Calloused now, but warm. A year passed like wind through wheat. On a spring afternoon, beneath the same oak tree where he'd once taught her to fire. A wooden rifle, they stood again. This time, they were surrounded by wildflowers and friends who no longer asked questions. Eliza wore a simple cream dress, her hair braided with blue thread. Boon stood beside her in his old shirt, the collar stiff but clean. There was no preacher, no vows. Only Hal reading a single line from her journal. She stayed. He stayed, and that was enough. At the end, a little girl, barefoot and wild-haired, ran between them, clutching a wooden toy horse. She squealed, "Ma, Pa!" Before tumbling into Boon's arms. Eliza scooped her close, laughing through quiet tears. Boon lifted his daughter high, the sunlight hitting her face and his heart at once. He looked up at the sky, his eyes wet but steady. Then he whispered, for no one but the wind and the woman beside him to hear. No name. No chains, just us.